what Saratoga has led directly to is what Britain desperately wanted to avoid, and that is a war with now one or more of their continental neighbors. Their hated enemy, France. Later, Spain will come into the war as a direct result of Saratoga.
Hi, this is Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at BRI, and we're pleased to bring you a Scholar Talk series on pivotal battles in American history. For this episode, we're very honored to have Kevin Weddle, scholar, who is going to discuss the Battle of Saratoga. And the guiding question for this series, of course, is how did this battle shape the outcome of the war with which it was associated, and why was it pivotal in American history? And Dr. Kevin Weddle, by way of introduction, is a professor of military theory and strategy and the Elihu Root Chair of Military Studies at the U.S. Army War College at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. He's a graduate of West Point and served over 28 years as a combat engineer officer. Throughout his career, he worked in a variety of command and staff positions in the United States and abroad, and is a veteran of Operations Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and Operation Enduring Freedom. He's the author of the excellent book, The Compleat Victory, Saratoga, and the American Revolution, which will inform today's discussion. Kevin, first of all, I want to thank you for your service, but also thank you for joining me to discuss the Battle of Saratoga.
Oh, thanks, Tony. I'm really pleased to be here.
All right, thank you. Well, let's jump right into the conversation, maybe lay the scene a little bit. The British plans for major operations in 1777, this is just after Trenton and Princeton, focused on a complex three-pronged assault of upstate New York. So can you describe the plan and its objectives, as well as how it perhaps quickly became unraveled because of issues in the senior British command?
Sure. Well, as you said, as the war progressed into late 1776, early 1777, the British pretty much had figured out that they needed to come up with some sort of new strategy to end the war, and they wanted to end the war in 1777. So two plans were offered up. The first one by Lieutenant General John Burgoyne, who had been the second in command in Canada, but now he had returned home to London. So he was in London. He presented this plan, and he presented it to the King and Lord George Germain. George Germain was the Secretary of the State for the colonies, and so his job was basically to manage the war in North America. So this plan, as you already mentioned, very complex, very ambitious. It called for three converging columns. One column coming down from Canada, that would be the main army under General Burgoyne, going down Lake Champlain into Lake George, and then ultimately the Hudson River Valley, all the way to Albany, New York. The other supporting column would also come from Canada. This would be a smaller column, going into Lake Ontario and then into Western New York. It would then link up with the Mohawk River Valley and then follow the Mohawk River all the way down to Albany, and there link up with General Burgoyne. And then finally, the main British Army, which was in New York City, under the command of Sir William Howe, General Sir William Howe, the commander-in-chief in North America. Burgoyne called for his army to go up the Hudson River. Again, all of these three columns converging on Albany, and then doing some sort of unspecified operations into New England. The idea was to split the more rebellious New England colonies away from what they thought were the less rebellious middle colonies and southern colonies by controlling the entire Hudson River, Lake Champlain corridor. So that was Burgoyne's plan. It was enthusiastically embraced by the King and Lord Germain. They really liked this idea. They had sort of tried it in 1776, but it didn't work out. So that's one piece of this. At the same time, General Sir William Howe, who was the commander-in-chief in North America, presents his own plan. His plan was quite different, and that was what he wanted to do is he wanted to take the main army, his main army, under his command. He wanted to take his army, seize Philadelphia, And in the process of seizing Philadelphia, the sort of nominal capital of the rebellion, the seat of Congress, of course, the Continental Congress, that he assumed that Washington would have to defend the capital. And so Howe would get a decisive battle. He'd defeat Washington. And by that time in the war, Howe had pretty much figured out that Washington and his main army was the center of gravity for the rebellion. And he thought if he could destroy Washington and his main army, the rebellion would be over. Well, those were two very different plans. And so it was up to Lord George Germain, also with some input from the king. It was up to Lord George Germain to reconcile these two plans, either somehow coordinate these two plans or to pick one and go with it. That's not how it worked out. And one of the big problems was you had, three of the big decision makers are sitting there in London, Burgoyne and Germain and the king, and sitting in New York City is General Sir William Howe. Well, they're 3,000 miles apart. Today, it's no big deal. Back then, it was a big deal. It could take up to 3 months to get a message, to North America and back again to England. So how do you coordinate military operations? Well, it's really hard. And so what ends up happening is Germain tries to have it both ways. He approves Burgoyne's plan, but he also approves Howe's plan, with the proviso that once Howe seizes Philadelphia, he will then go assist Burgoyne. Well, as you might imagine, with all the orders crossing back and forth across the Atlantic, there's going to become some problems with coordination. There's going to be some miscommunications. There are going to be some misunderstandings of what's required when. And so, in fact, in my book, I've got a detailed appendix that sort of follows the breadcrumbs of when all these messages get sent and when they get received. And you can see how this strategy sort of falls apart. And so what ends up happening is, instead of having a coordinated, comprehensive military strategy for 1777, you have a very disjointed, really two separate strategies that in some ways are actually almost working in cross purposes. So basically, both generals are going to try to execute their own individual strategies with very little coordination between the two. And what ends up happening, really, you can almost trace everything that happens in 1777 to this misfire, faulty British strategy.
Right, and on the other hand, the relationships among the major commanders were well, really little better on in the northern department. On the American side, right? They have their own problems, and so how does that impact American preparations going in?
Right. There are some problems in the American Northern Army. There's two major American armies. There's the big one under George Washington. And then there's a smaller army up in what was called the Northern Department. It was basically Fort Ticonderoga, some other fortifications in New York, but basically upstate New York. And that was commanded by General Philip Schuyler. Now, Schuyler, after the 1776 campaign, he had gotten some criticism for his performance during that campaign. And he decides in April of 1777 to travel down to Philadelphia and sort of present his case, sort of defend himself against this criticism. In the meantime, Congress had sent Major General Horatio Gates up to the Northern Department, not to command the department, but to command at Fort Ticonderoga, which he had done earlier in 1776. So he had a lot of experience with that. So when Gates arrives in the Northern Department, Gates is a really ambitious guy. He thinks he should have his own independent command. He basically fills the vacuum that Schuyler has left by going down to Philadelphia, and he basically takes over the Northern Army, the Northern Department. And he never travels to Fort Ticonderoga. And so consequently, the defense of Fort Ticonderoga, the defenses, the preparations for any any British offensive coming down from Canada really isn't well supervised or well prepared. And so what happens is in the Northern Department in the spring and early summer of 1777, you have this really controversy about who's really commanding up there. Is it Gates or is it Schuyler sitting down there in Philadelphia? And it really isn't until later in the campaigning season that Congress finally says, no, it's Philip Schuyler who is commanding up there. And Gates leaves in a huff. He's all upset that he's been sort of, his rightful command of the Northern Department has been taken away from him, and he leaves in a huff. And Schuyler returns and he takes over, but really only a few weeks before Burgoyne actually shows up outside Ticonderoga. So consequently, that and the general who's in charge of Ticonderoga, Major General Arthur Sinclair, who does not fare well in my book. I think his leadership is really lacking. He's given a tough mission, but he still doesn't do a very good job. But at any rate, when Burgoyne does show up at Ticonderoga, which Burgoyne assumes is going to be the toughest part of his campaign, turns out to be very easy. He outmaneuvers Sinclair and forces Sinclair to evacuate the fort without expending almost any casualties at all. I mean, Sinclair does a horrible job defending the fort, and Burgoyne is able to capture it within a couple days.
Right. And my next question is, one of the reasons why I love the Compleat Victory, your new book, is that, it takes what's really a campaign more than just a battle. And it's a complex campaign, and it makes it very easy to follow. So that's one of the remarkable achievements, I think, of the book. And so can you help our viewers, as you did with your readers, understand the course of this campaign from what you just mentioned, the fall of Ticonderoga, to Burgoyne's very slow march across upstate New York, Battle of Bennington, and of course, his penultimate battle or battles, really, of Saratoga.
Right, Tony, I'm glad you mentioned that. I think one of the things I tried to do is try to make sense of the campaign. As you said, it's a very complex campaign. There's a lot going on. There's something like 10 battles and engagements. There's all sorts of very complex maneuvers, and there's river crossings. There's all sorts of things happening. And at the same time, Washington is fighting a Philadelphia campaign, which of course impacts on what's going on up in the north as well. So trying to make sense of that is a challenge. But the first major event that happens in the campaign is Burgoyne seizing Fort Ticonderoga, and he does that, as we already mentioned, with ease in early July 1777. It's a huge shock to the American system. I mean, no one expected this to happen. If Ticonderoga were to fall, Americans would assume that it would take weeks and weeks for that to happen. But it happens in just a couple days. So it's a huge shock. It's just stunning. And on the British side, it feeds Burgoyne's confidence, overconfidence, hubris, maybe, after he seizes Fort Ticonderoga. So after he seizes Fort Ticonderoga, Burgoyne consolidates his army and gets ready to continue to move on. The Americans fall back. Schuyler, who's again now back in command of the Northern Department, he pulls his army back together. He does a pretty decent job of kind of restoring the shattered army after the retreat out of Ticonderoga. Although you wouldn't know that from his panicky messages that he's sending back to Congress and George Washington, which will ultimately be his downfall. The other thing he does is when Burgoyne does start to move again and continues to move south toward Albany, he's traveling on one very poor road. He has to move his entire army on one bad road. And Schuyler does a good job of obstructing that road, slowing Burgoyne down, which is going to cause Burgoyne some problems as he continues to move south. So Burgoyne moves south. One of the problems with Burgoyne's entire operation is when he leaves Canada, he leaves without enough logistics support, and he leaves knowingly. I mean, he understands that he doesn't have enough when he leaves, but he thinks he can make up for that with loyalist support in New York. Well, the loyalists don't come out though in droves like he thinks they will. So that becomes a problem as he continues to penetrate further and further into New York, heading toward Albany. He runs into more and more logistical problems, and that will really end up being a real issue for him. Now, while all this is going on, while Burgoyne is slowly moving south toward Fort Edward and then ultimately toward Fort Miller, very, very slowly as he's moving south, the supporting attack into Lake Ontario and then to the Mohawk River is also being conducted at the same time. They run into also a fort that's guarding the entrance to the Mohawk River Valley, and that's Fort Stanwix. Unlike Fort Ticonderoga, Fort Stanwix is manned by a plucky bunch of Americans under Colonel Peter Gansevoort, and Colonel Gansevoort is made of much sterner stuff than Major General Arthur Sinclair. And Gansevoort, even though he's outnumbered 3-1 at Fort Stanwix, he holds on to that fort after even throughout a 22-day siege. And really, one of my personal favorite parts of the entire campaign is the siege of Fort Stanwix and the American performance there at Fort Stanwix of Colonel Gansevoort and his garrison. So that takes place there. Ultimately, that column will be forced to fall back to Canada because they can't get to the Mohawk River unless they seize Fort Stanwix, and Gansevoort is not going to allow that to happen. So ultimately, they will fall back to Canada. So Burgoyne is kind of on his own now because Howe has moved to Philadelphia by sea. It's going to take him a while to get there because of contrary winds. It is the age of sail after all. And Burgoyne will continue marching south. When he gets to Fort Miller, his logistical situation is now dire. Now, he has heard through intelligence, his Indians and also some loyalist support that there's a lot of cattle and also carts and wagons, which he is very short of those transportation assets. So that there's food and transportation assets at a place called Bennington, Vermont. So he decides to send a large foraging party, for want of a better term, foraging expedition of 1,000 men, mostly German soldiers, because he's got German mercenaries along with his British regulars. He's going to send this 1,000-man detachment to go to Bennington, seize those supplies, and that will give him the logistics support that allow him to continue on to Albany. They're intercepted outside of Bennington. While they're actually still in New York, they're intercepted outside Bennington by a primarily American militia force under General Stark, John Stark, who coined the famous phrase "live free or die" for the New Hampshire motto. And they basically destroy that German foraging expedition. So now Burgoyne's in big trouble. He's just lost 1,000 men. He's got big time logistical problems. And instead of falling back to Fort Ticonderoga and maybe regrouping, he decides to press on. Now, as a historian, it's very easy to use hindsight to look at decisions and say, wow, what a dumb decision. But instead, you've got to try at least look at, what sort of information did Burgoyne have at the time that he used to base his decision on. And, I tried to be as fair as I possibly could to all these senior leaders and looking at how they made these decisions. And so when I look at Burgoyne making this decision, which I think is one of the most fateful decisions in the entire campaign, to push on after Bennington, he's got all the information he needs at that point. He knows Howe is going to Philadelphia and he's not coming up the Hudson River. He knows the Americans have obviously regrouped after the disaster at Ticonderoga. Otherwise, he wouldn't have lost those, 1,000 regular, trained European soldiers to a bunch of militia, which he's just done. And, he still has a long way to go to Albany. So do you press on or do you fall back? And he would argue later that my orders gave me no latitude. I had to press on. Well, that's nonsense, of course, to be shackled to a plan that was written 5 months before, 3,000 miles away. And now you're in the midst of the American wilderness and things are not turning out the way you assumed it would. At any rate, he does press on. So he continues on. He crosses over to the west bank of the Hudson River. In the meantime, Schuyler, because of his panicky messages back to Washington and Congress, has been relieved of his command. He's been replaced now by Horatio Gates. Gates will move the army slowly up from Albany, where Schuyler has retreated. He'll move it up to Albany. He'll find a defensive position, a wonderful defensive position called Bemis Heights that dominates the Hudson River at that point, and also the road to Albany, the single road to Albany. And he sets up defensive positions there. And ultimately, they'll fight the two big battles of Saratoga that we of course remember when we think of Saratoga and the Saratoga campaign. They'll fight the two big battles just north of Bemis Heights.
Right, great. Yeah, just a great story. So, and you credit that ultimate American victory of Saratoga to some excellent, particularly excellent American field commanders, including perhaps most surprisingly to our viewers, the bold and valiant Benedict Arnold, right? Not yet a traitor.
Right.
And to American generals who use this term, I love it. They had more grip of the battlefields. So can you explain the importance of these factors to that American victory?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would say that, when you look at both sides, the Americans and the British and the German soldiers as well, from the colonel level on down, regimental commander on down, I mean, both sides had really excellent commanders. I mean, they led from the front. They were, personally, brave and courageous. They took care of their soldiers. I mean, leadership is really good, I think, on both sides. I never found an instance of a key officer shirking or doing anything like that. It was at the higher levels, I think, that the Americans excelled. And at both battles of Saratoga, you see that. The general officers and the senior colonels really did well, and of course Benedict Arnold is of course foremost in that, and especially in the second battle of Saratoga, the Battle of Bemis Heights. Arnold, I mean, he's been everywhere in the American Revolution in the Northern Department up to this point. He's aggressive, he's dynamic, he's personally brave, he's always at the front. I mean, this guy is exactly the kind of combat commander you want. And one of the reasons why Washington will send Arnold up to join Schuyler after Ticonderoga is he wanted to put some backbone into the Northern Army, and that's of course what Arnold does. Arnold injects energy into the army, and so Gates and Arnold turn out to be a pretty decent team. Now they have a bit of a falling out. We probably won't be able to get to any of that, but they have a falling out between the two battles. But they actually work fairly well together. They had worked together before in 1776 and had worked very well together, so they work well here. And Arnold ends up leading the sort of the final assault that unhinges Burgoyne's line in the second Battle of Saratoga, which will really give Burgoyne no choice other than to fall back and retreat. And ultimately, of course, the Americans will surround him at a place called Saratoga, about 8 miles north of where they fight these final two battles. Arnold is just brilliant during this campaign and during the final pieces of this campaign. Of course, he's seriously wounded at the second Battle of Saratoga. And in part, that wound and his convalescence and his later assignment to West Point will end up, leading to his treason later on in the war. But up to this point, I mean, if probably would have been better had he been killed at the Second Battle of Saratoga, because he would be, in the pantheon of great American heroes because of his performance in those first couple of years of the war, and specifically at Saratoga.
Very, very interesting. Okay, so my final question relates to our general question for the series. And so, how did the Battle of Saratoga shape the outcome of the Revolutionary War briefly,
Sure.
and of American history?
Sure. I kind of look at it as sort of the short-term implications of the campaign and the long-term. So short-term, there's only two major British field armies in North America. They've just lost one now. So that's a huge deal. They've got to replace those troops, and that's kind of hard to do. The Brits, there is opposition in Parliament to the war. That opposition is going to increase. It's going to be emboldened. It's going to be more vocal after Saratoga. So you have all those issues. You have issues in the American side too, because a lot of people are starting to think, George Washington hasn't really produced a whole lot of victories, but Gates has just won this, the greatest victory we could possibly imagine. So big deal. Long term, though, what the American victory at Saratoga does long term is it jumpstarts the American diplomatic mission in Paris, led by Benjamin Franklin. On the 4th of December, 1777, they get word of Saratoga. Just a couple days later, the King of France authorizes a restart of the negotiations that will lead to the formal alliance with France, the United States and France, which will take place early in February of 1778. And right after that, Britain will declare war against France. And now what Saratoga has led directly to is what Britain desperately wanted to avoid, and that is a war with now one or more of their continental neighbors. Their hated enemy, France. Later, Spain will come into the war as a direct result of Saratoga. So I would argue that, Saratoga isn't sufficient for American victory, but it is necessary. There had to be a Saratoga. It didn't have to be Saratoga itself, but it had to be something like Saratoga that would really prove to the French that we were in it for the long haul. We could win. We could win a big victory. France comes in, and of course, as Winston Churchill famously said, there's only one thing worse than fighting with allies. It's not having an ally, or worse to that effect. And the France turns out to be a difficult ally, but ultimately, of course, they initially give us some naval support. They will ultimately land a major army in North America. It will ultimately, as we know, link up with George Washington, which will end up in the final decisive victory at Yorktown. But you couldn't have had a Yorktown without a Saratoga.
Right. Kevin Weddle, I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Tony.
Very good, and congratulations on your new book, The Compleat Victory, Saratoga and the American Revolution.
Oh, I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Great. And thank you all for joining us for this episode of Scholar Talks. Please check out our other installments of Pivotal Battles in American History on the Battle of Gettysburg with Alan Gelzo and the Battle of Midway with Craig Simons, and our previous series on the Cold War and the presidency, and also Black intellectuals and the African American experience. Thank you for joining us.